Welcome, Margaret.
Good evening, and thank you for joining the Hispanic Society's 2021 concert series, Apollo and Daphne, a zarzuela by Sebastián Durón and Juan de Navas, who lived at the turn of the 18th century. Tonight, I have the pleasure to introduce you to two wonderful and talented individuals, Baroque opera veteran Guillaume Bernardi and artistic director of the Sonnambula, Elizabeth Weinfield. Together, Guillaume and Elizabeth will explore the fascinating process of mounting an opera production and speak specifically about the North American premiere of the opera Apollo and Daphne, which will feature later this year. We're always delighted to collaborate with Sonnambula, and we are really excited to be involved with the series dedicated to the opera this year. I want to make sure we extend our gratitude to our members of the Hispanic Society for their continued support. Your support and participation are essential to the success of these programs. And if you're not a member of the Hispanic Society, I encourage you to become a member by visiting our website at hispanicsociety.org. This program is also supported in part by the public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council and the New York State Council of the Arts. So a few words about our special guest. Elizabeth Weinfield and her team have been wonderful friends and contributors to the music programs here at the Hispanic Society. Elizabeth is founder and artistic director of the ensemble Sonnambula. She teaches in the music history department at Juilliard here in New York City. She holds a PhD in historical musicology from the Graduate Center of CUNY and has a master's in music from Oxford. Guillaume Bernardi, we are really excited to have you tonight. He is a Toronto-based stage director and dramaturge and professor. Guillaume holds a doctorate from the Sorbonne in Paris, and he teaches theater at York University in Toronto. And he joins us this evening from Toronto, and it's really one of the privileges of being able to do these programs virtually. So thank you, Elizabeth and Guillaume. It's really a delight to have you here with us. This stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Gracias a Margaret, a la coordinadora de eventos especiales, Mencia Figuera, a los directores y a la Junta Directiva de la Sociedad Hispánica por su continuo apoyo a la estadía de conciertos. Buenos días. Sean todos bienvenidos. Es triste de poder verlos en persona en este momento, pero estamos muy contentos de conectarnos de ustedes de esta manera. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you to Mencia Figuera, the coordinator of special events at the Hispanic Society, and thank you to the directors and the Board of Trustees at the Hispanic Society for your continued support of the concert series. Hello and welcome to our community. It's very sad that we can't see you in person yet right now, but we're so happy to be able to connect with you in this way. This is the first of a series of digital events in the lead up to our major project of this season, which I'm excited to officially share with you now, a production of scenes and selections from the opera Apollo and Daphne, which, as Margaret said, is a collaborative work written in the final years of the 17th century by Sebastián Durón and Juan de Navas. A piece that until now hasn't ever been performed in North America. The work is particularly interesting, I think, in that it's scored for an all-female cast of, in fact, 7 sopranos. But because of the necessary precautions that we have to take due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we won't be performing this in front of a live audience, but rather our plan is to produce a beautiful production for no audience, but straight to video. And then we will stream it for you for free over the Hispanic Society's channels later this year. But meanwhile, as we prepare the process of putting this all together, we thought that because we're not together in person right now, why not involve our audience in the development of the work while we're still getting to know the piece at large. And this is where our first guest comes in, acclaimed Baroque opera director Guillaume Bernardi, with whom we're so lucky to be working with as stage director for this production. Next month, I will return to you here with Esteban Lorota and some of the other musicians from the cast, in particular Camille Zamora, who will be starring as Daphne, to discuss sort of the more musicological and performative aspects of the work. In May, two of the musicians from Sonnambula, Jude Ziliak, violin, and James Kennerly, harpsichord, will present a concert of Spanish music for the violin and the harpsichord that is largely informed by some of the musical styles that we see in this work. And then finally, later in the summer, likely at the end of June, we will broadcast a shortened version of the opera for you, with the hopes that at some point in the future, we can mount the completely staged work live at the Hispanic Society. So, as you heard from Margaret, Guillaume is a veteran of the Baroque opera stage. So Guillaume, hello. Let's start with you at the very beginning. I want to start with the plot of the opera. The plot of the opera is such a commonly set story in Baroque opera. The story of Apollo and Daphne from the Ovid. Can you tell us a little bit more about this story, and particularly its origins in opera, in Baroque opera more generally?
Muchas gracias, Elizabeth. Muchas gracias, Margaret. Me da muchísimo gusto estar con ustedes. Y sí, es la primera vez que puedo trabajar con ustedes. Es una magnífica oportunidad. Tengo muchas ganas de desarrollar este proyecto. Sí, Apolo y Dafne. Yes, Margaret, as you said, so the theme itself, so during the Renaissance, of course, there was the re-evaluation, let's put it this way, not the rediscovery, the re-evaluation of Ovid and of his metamorphoses. And among those metamorphoses, of course, one of the most popular stories was Apollo and Daphne. And the plot was very, very popular with all art form, really. So as we know, there were many, many representations of it. And maybe we can look at some of them, and so we can actually tell a little bit the story while watching those images, and then we can move on to the opera. So probably many of you will recognize one of the, maybe the most famous representation of Apollo and Daphne, the sculpture by Bernini in Rome, in the Galleria Borghese. And so this is, this is a young, a youthful work in the career of Bernini. And already Bernini captured the key moment of the story. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story, but just to remind what the story elements are. There is a rivalry, I'm making it very simple. There is a rivalry between Apollo and the god of love, and love, Eros, to get a revenge from Apollo, send an arrow in Apollo's heart or eyes, making him fall in love with Daphne. And of course, to Daphne, he sent the arrow of disdain. And so, of course, Daphne will run away from him. So, as you know, the key moment of the story is Apollo is crazed with love for Daphne, and Daphne absolutely doesn't want to even be touched by him. And so, in the key scene of the story, when Apollo pursues Daphne, Daphne asks a favor from her father, the river god, to transform her, not to allow Apollo to violate her. And then at that moment, she transforms herself into a laurel tree. So this is the story, and this is a story which has been represented many, many times. Now, the one thing which I think is very important is, the story seems very simple. The plot is very simple, Apollo falls in love with Daphne, runs after Daphne. Daphne, if he turns him out, turns him down, and becomes a laurel tree. So this is very simple. But what I think was very important for the artists of the Baroque era, let's call them like this in a generic term, was all the opportunities that the story, all the artistic, expressive opportunity that the story allowed. So here in the Bernini sculpture, well, first, of course, it was an opportunity for Bernini to display his incredible talent. I mean, you really have to see it in, if I may say, in the flesh, just because the way the sculptor has represented that captured the flesh of the Apollon Daphne and the hair, the leaf is just incredible. But what I would like to focus more maybe is just on the expressivity of the moment, as I hope you can see it quite well. In that representation, Bernini does capture the fear of Daphne. Her face, you cannot see it close by, but it's a face expressing fear, loathing. She really is trying to run away from him. And Apollo is represented in an interesting way. We will talk with Elizabeth later about that. As you can see, the body of Apollo is a very, it's not a Greek god. It's quite a feminine, soft body. And I think that's kind of an important element in the story. So, he's a youthful, barely masculine body. As you can see, it's quite a soft body. So, and Apollo is kind of surprised, but he looked more stunned than anything else. The key expressivity here is on Daphne's face. A few years later, and maybe we can see the next image, this is another painting from Rome by another, it's just a few decades later. It's a not very well-known painter, Albani, but here you can see that already the same story, it's just a couple of minutes before. So you can see just choosing the moment really allows many, many different interpretations. But what you can see here already, and this is, I think, the important thing is, first, you can see that the god of love is there. So that's one of the characters which we'll find in the opera as well. Eros is there, you can see in the clouds, and you can see also the river behind, which is the father of Daphne. But what I want to draw your attention on is more the expressivity of the gesture. That's a very Baroque kind of characteristic, how each of them has very clear feeling. The feelings are very clearly expressed. So you can really see that in this case, Apollo is begging, and he's not overwhelming her. It's kind of a soft, he's not a violent man. He's really imploring her. You can see in the hand gesture, and Daphne is refusing him, but again, more with contempt rather than anger or anything. So this is just before the key moment. So of course, all those works operate on the mind of the spectator, of an audience who knows the story. So of course, the audience knows that in a couple of steps, Apollo will touch Daphne, and Daphne will transform itself on the river, on the river bank, really. A few years later, we see the next slide, and this is an image which is by Tiepolo. We are now in the 18th century. We are a few years after the zarzuela, but you can see that already the story here again is quite different. As you can see, the framing is quite different. You can see that here you recognize the construction of Bernini. So Bernini's culture, of course, was very well known by the time of Tiepolo, and you can see that already just the composition evoke already. So there is a kind of, as we say in academia, intertextual quotation. There is a reference to the earlier work. But as you can see, the mood is very, very different. You can see that if you look at the face of Daphne, you can see that there is something supremely kind of elegant. She's just turning yourself away from it. And the hands also, the transformation is quite gentle, really. So as we can see, and you can see also the classic thing, Apollo become a much more masculine kind of body, darker body, sun, more of an athlete, and the Daphne is more feminine. You can see also the two other characters which feature in the story, the little god of love who supports Daphne, and the father of Daphne, the river god at the feet. You can see that he's the river god. You can see the big vase which allegorically symbolize the river. So what we can, those are three of the many representations. But what they really show is, first they tell the story, just the key moment of the story, but they also tell how differently the story can be told, really. I think this is really the key thing. So, yes.
Guillaume, I want to interrupt with a question, and I apologize for my sometimes faulty internet connection, it looks like. We're looking at paintings here which grapple with the moment of depiction. And in an opera that is 2.5 hours long, we're faced with a lot of moments here. So granted, you can take a lot from these images, but I wonder, what do these images tell you about the kind of climactic point of the work and where that is placed in a longer temporal entity, reality?
Right. So exactly as you point out, I mean, those are 1 minute really, but of course the opera lasts many hours. So you need to develop a sequel of scenes to develop that. So now the interesting thing is Daphne, from the very beginning of opera, fascinated the musician and librettist. So in fact, one of the first opera we know is a Daphne by Peri. And in fact, Daphne was done many times as an opera piece throughout the 17th and 18th century. Just, just to mention a piece that maybe you saw or heard, around the time of the zarzuela, Handel wrote a big dramatic cantata, Apollon and Daphne. But before that, so there was the first Daphne by Peri. Then in the 17th century, there is a big Cavalli opera, Gli Amori di Apollo e Dafne. So all of them, and then before that, there was a key work, really. There was the Peri Daphne, then there is, which is lost. Then there is a first opera that we do have, it's the Daphne by Marco da Galliano. Now that opera is very important because it was done on the same libretto as Peri, but it was done in Mantua just around the same years that Monteverdi's Orfeo. And in fact, with some of the same performers. So in fact, the Marco da Galliano opera is very important for the history of opera. Also, there is something which, musicologists revel is Marco da Galliano left a lot of indication on how to do the piece. So in fact, there is a huge amount of information on how to stage the work. So this is very rich work. So, so what Peri did, what the librettist, I think it's Rinuccini now, I should double check that, but anyway, what the librettist did, he developed the story in a series of scenes, and the scene goes back from the river, from Apollo fighting the snake, the monster. There is an allusion to that. There is a kind of monstrous snake which torment the Dennis and the peasant, or the pastori of Greece, and then so there is Apollo defeating the monster. Then there is the conflict between Apollo and Eros. So Apollo makes fun of the boy, and then there is a key thing. This is really one of the key allegorical features of the piece. All those pieces, as you know, I mean, in 17th century. Post Tridentina, post Council of Trent mentality, you could have fun, but you still had to have some kind of moral instruction. So the opera had to have some kind of moral instruction, and of course, one of the instructions is the damages that love does. So of course, Apollo, despise Eros, and Eros take his revenge. And then, of course, then the scenes just unfold. Apollo starts pursuing Daphne. Daphne turns him down, and then the story goes as we know. So this is how this is really the very early opera. So when we talk about Peri and Marco da Galliano, we are talking very, very early opera, quite different really from the piece that Durón and Navas did later.
Absolutely.
What happened in between?
I mean, this really leads me to my next question, which is, how is this story, which at the time of the work that we're considering was written, is already a story that audiences knew well, not least of which from opera already, from musical dramatic works on the stage. So how is this story treated in zarzuela more generally? And are there differences between how it's typically treated by Italian composers, librettists, and how it's treated by Spanish dramatic theater traditions? And what are those?
Absolutely, absolutely. So this is really one of the key things. So, in the 17th century, many huge transformations happened for the opera. I mean, that's when opera get developed. And so the zarzuela is influenced by two things, which at that time worked a lot together. I mean, I'm not going, many books have been written about that. So on one hand is the Commedia del Siglo de Oro, the Spanish Comedian, and Italian opera as developed in Venice from the mid 1630s in Venice. So the two, and in fact, Commedia and opera had a lot of interaction. So specifically what happened was, in fact, the direct source of the librettist in the plural, because apparently, just like there were two composers, there were also two librettists, the main source of inspiration is a Calderon play. So a late Calderon play. So Calderon, as you know, was the major writer of the 17th century. So already Calderon wrote a commedia called El Laurel de Apollo. And so Calderon already had reshaped the myth according to the canonical traits of the commedia. That is 3 jornadas and that kind of framing.
Can you tell us what a jornada is?
So the Commedia del Siglo de Oro, as they were developed at the end of the 16th century and in the beginning of the 17th century by the big playwright Lope de Vega, Tirso de Molina. So the Commedia usually, in most cases, when it was a Commedia of that kind for entertainment, was divided in 3 what we would call acts, but they would call jornadas, also just to indicate the fact that they did not, contrary to what was happening in other culture, like in France, for instance, they were not respecting the unity of time. So in fact, there was a lot of time in between the 3 days, really. Mm-hmm. So, and one of the characteristics, in fact, which, one of the characteristics of those comedies as well was there was a great number of performers, which meant that the plots were always doubled up. So, whereas an opera like the Marco da Galliano Daphne was quite simple, right away, once you move to the Spanish style, you will have much more complex plot because you will have more characters. So, there is, for instance, there is always the noble characters, like, the aristocrat, in this case, Apollon and Daphne, and there is the comedic characters, the gracioso. So in this case, of course, there is Rustico and Lisetta in the zarzuela. This is let me just, so that's the Commedia heritage, but there's another big heritage, which is, and maybe we can just look at the next image for a second, which was the big Venetian invention.
Yes.
The next one. So, yes, which was, and this is kind of the big difference between, late Spanish theater of the 17th century. So as you
I have
probably,
to just interject and say, this sort of reminds me of the Hispanic Society's main hall a little bit.
well, probably, that's where it comes,
Columnar.
So, yeah. So the Commedia was done in the Chorale de Commedia, which was more like, like the Globe, if I may jump, it was more like the Globe Theatre for Shakespeare, an open air space. By the second half of the 17th century, the Italian influence of closed opera houses with machine and perspective came in. And so here you can see why I'm interested in this image is like in the zarzuela, they do use machines. So you can see that there is a god on a cloud. So in fact, in the zarzuela, they did use that kind of machine already. So they use both they use the Spanish tradition of the Commedia Nueva, but they also use already the machinery, which was so typical of opera at that time. And so this is really how so just to kind of try to summarize a little bit. So by the time that we see the zarzuela Apolo y Dafne, the journey in the last 100 years being major, so it started in the late 16th century with the birth of opera, but then it has been reworked through Commedia Nueva, Spanish Commedia, the opera world. So by the time of Durón y Navas, we have really a very complex product, if I can use that term, really, which has really kind of fused all those influences.
So we have this history in Italian dramatic commedia, and then the Spanish tradition as well. How crucial are the comedic roles in the opera? And maybe we could talk about what those comedic roles are. Rustico and Lisetta, the subplot of these two characters. What is the purpose of two comedic roles in zarzuela?
Right. So this is a very important. In fact, it looked like it could look like comedic relief, but in fact, I do think it says something very profound about the Baroque mentality. So this is really the high age of the Baroque, and as we all know, Baroque, Spain was really the land of the Baroque. Even if it. Italy, of course, was very important for the development, but Spain is really the place where it kind of took flight. So one of the ideas of the Baroque is, of course, there are always two ways of looking at things. There is a sublime way and the grotesque way. So in fact, the presence of the comedic character, sure, they allow a contrast, variety, but they also say something very deep about the nature of life. That life is something sublime, but it's something ridiculous. Just to go back to Calderon, if we just look at the beginning of La Vida y Sueño, it starts with, Rosaura, just all the beautiful poetry, and then the gracioso come in and say, yes, what about me? And so, that way it's body and mind, all those kind of differences. So the graciosos part are very, very important. They were, of course, very popular actors, but I think also they say something very, very important about the way people went through life, so that life is at the same time sublime and grotesque. I think that's a very, very important, that's the essence of the Baroque mind.
Well aware of that.
They were intensely aware of that,
Yes. I know we're going to talk a little about your staging choices and how they're evolving and what our idea for our final product will be. But in terms of how you stage the duality of the sublime and the grotesque, what is your sort of initial approach? Do you look at imagery? Do you start with the score? Do you start with the music?
Well, this is, I would say, just to get, this is just to get away from the question, I would just say that, of course, each work is different. One thing which inspired me in this piece, in the conversation we had, Elizabeth, is the fact that it's all cast with women. So I think that's a very, that's a very important feature, very unique. This is a very Spanish feature, which is very different from the tradition in all the other European countries at the time. So, what can we say about that? We can say two things, I would say. There are two things which need to be pointed out. One is, maybe let's start with the most historical one. So, of course, one of the big features of Baroque theater, it started in Italy, was that, as you know, probably we are all aware that in the early 16th century, throughout Europe, theater was only performed by men. We all know that in Shakespeare, Juliet and Cleopatra were played by very young men. So, of course, the big innovation is in the middle of the 16th century in Italy, they invent, let's say this way, the figure, and I'm using I know we don't use the feminine anymore, but just for the clarity, we use the actress, the prima donna, the diva, and of course that will completely change the way theater is done, really. This is a major, major change, that suddenly there are female performers, not only female performers, but performers who really hold the stage and who are essential.
Oh, yeah. I think, of course, you brought up Cavalli before, you brought up Handel before. We can certainly read this into both. I mean, we know Handel often composed in conjunction for some of his singers, particularly the women, rewriting arias for them.
Absolutely.
We were just talking the other day about Ellen Rosen's work on Cavalli, how Cavalli's copyist, who was his wife, contributed in great ways to the work's reception and so forth.
Absolutely. This is a very important thing. Now, the other side, of course, is, if I can again speak generically, of course, our sense of gender is very, very different from the Baroque sense of gender. To go back to Cavalli and Venice, of course, that's Italy invented the castrato. In fact, the theory said that it was invented in Spain and then imported to Italy, and that's when in Italy that it was really developed. So, gender was very, very different in the 17th century than it is today. One of the things which was very, very important, and this is one possible answer to why all parts were done by women, was traditionally heroic parts were done by high voice, by soprano voices. Mm-hmm. So in Italy, for instance, to go back to Cavalli for a second, the key Cavalli piece, Jasone, so Jason, the hero, the Greek hero, was sung by a castrato, so by a high voice. So of course, for them, there is, it's not a realistic theater. So in any case, what is important is the symbolism of the high voice. And of course, the best way to have a high voice is just to ask female singers to perform, really. But as you say, this has huge implication on the whole way the piece is built, just having women performing it.
Absolutely.
So it really makes you think a lot,
Yeah, if we think about women's roles, let's say more generally, in the production of music in the early modern world, which is something that I think a lot about, it forces us in a sense to reconsider, I think it's fair to say, these more traditional modes of music production, even these modes that we do often hear about in the early modern period. For example, patron commissions composer, piece is written, piece is performed, piece is printed, copied, circulated, received in various ways. But this is a narrative, though, in the historiography, which so often leaves the female voice out. So I feel like we're so sort of immersed in a kind of feminized context in a way with this work. And I wonder what you make of the casting in a performative sense. Is there a way that we can?
Yeah, so there is one thing which, sorry.
One
thing.
Please.
one thing, just to follow up on what you say, is for me it says one thing, is that the performer is at the center. You know what I mean? Is we tend, in the kind of post 19th century, we tend to put the composer, the author, at the top of the metaphor, of the pyramid. But of course, in the 17th century, of course, the performer is key, the diva, that's why they invented the prima donna, primo uomo, those characters were really, really essential. So of course, and maybe this is actually kind of a good way of transitioning to our production. This is a big, this is an interesting challenge, because of course, how do especially if you use camera and things like that, probably they were used to a very stylized acting style. So for them, probably, because it was not a realistic acting style, it was easy. The suspension of disbelief, just to use that, was particularly easy in any case, just because everything was very stylized. And so, as long as you acted the male gender in your acting, you were male. You know what I mean? Is that gender was perceived as, if you were performing the male sign, you were a male, and if you were performing a female sign, you were female, really. So of course, this for us is a big challenge, and this is one of the things that has to be explored with the sensibility of the performer. And I think also we are more interested in alternative visions. You know what I mean? Is maybe we don't need to pretend that the Apollo is a man. We do play with those things.
It's possible to explore more sort of, I think it's possible to explore gender as a more fluid phenomenon.
For sure.
Dual bifurcation. Sure. We actually have, before we start to talk about our production, we have a question from email, which I will read to you, Guillaume. The question is, the violence of the Apollo and Daphne story is often veiled in romance, in the paintings. This is very true. And perhaps in the music as well, also true. This seems to be amplified by the gracioso. Do you think that this is true? Do you think that there is a renewed interest in the inherent violence and horror of the story?
I think this is one of the big, I would say that anybody who deals with Baroque theater has to deal with that kind of issue. I mean, it's clear that their world vision was radically different, even opposed to ours. It is a patriarchal society. It is a society where roles, what is expected from people is very, very strictly defined. The way manliness and femininity are codified are very strict and clearly in deep disagreement with us. So, and as the person who has a question pointed out, the gracioso could be used in many ways. And in fact, I do think that a modern sensibility, of course, would use it as a counterpoint rather than a reinforcement of the narrative. What I mean by that is, I cannot refer specifically to the specific zarzuela, but as a director, of course, you have a lot of space of how you want the text to sound. This is really what staging is all about, is how do you want to construct the message, really? Just without being too theoretical, I'm just going to give a classic example that is often used, that I always use when I teach my students. If you walk in the street and if you see a sign, some handwritten graffiti, and the graffiti says, "See you tonight." And what happened with the graffiti is, in fact, you don't know what "see you tonight" mean. Is it a threat? Is it a promise? You don't know. Why? Because what is missing is all the data around who is saying that. who says that, to whom that is said, in which tone that is said. So this is really what a lot of the director does, is defining those things. That's what we do when we cast. That's why casting is such an important thing, because according to whom you choose to say the words, that of course will give a huge amount of, it will deeply influence the meaning of the words. In a way, the words don't mean anything in themselves. I mean, it's only when they're put in the mouth of somebody or whoever says the word, how the words are said, which really will create the words. So to go back to the issue that was raised by the question, this is really where the directorial work and the dramaturgical work is very, very important. So, often people wonder what the hell is a dramaturgical work. This is really what dramaturgical work is about, is create the bridge between that text and our reality and our audiences. This is where the dramaturgical work goes, really. And so you have to create that complex balance between them and us, really. So this is really what we have to do. It's complex work.
Very much so, and it's even more complicated because of the various restrictions that are in front of us due to COVID-19. In a normal world, we would stage this in the Hispanic Society, in the main court, but they're still going through this wonderful renovation, and we are of course in quarantine. So we're forced to consider other opportunities and other possibilities, at least for now. And those, of course, pose a whole series of challenges. However, let's talk about the idea of a semi-staged opera more generally. Can you tell our audience what the main differences are between a fully staged opera and a semi-staged opera? Let's start there, and then let's move forward with how we're going to approach this work.
Great. So, again, maybe we can go back to the example before. There is a text, and then you start finding a cast, who is going to say those words. And then once you have decided who is going to be cast, then you're going to decide how is that person going to be dressed, and then how is that person going to be made up, and what kind of hair, and then in which kind of set they're going to move. So, staging is about layering, really. You start from, ground zero is the score, the libretto, the culture of the time, I mean, that can be defined in many, many ways, or your own agenda. You might decide that your agenda is the most important thing. I mean, you have a lot of space there. So once you have defined your ground zero, you will start building. So generally, I mean, at least my understanding is the semi-stage is just you start building those kind of stratas, and you just focus on the early stages of that work. Now, the good thing is, early stage doesn't, in fact, the early stage is the most important stage of the work, in the sense that that's where you need to have the most clarity. In a way, this, I mean, with all due respect for my colleagues who do makeup, hair, and all those things are extremely important, and they're essential to clarify the meaning. But of course, those come quite late. Before you have done that, you need to have done all the work before. So in fact, the same stage often focus on the key issue, the basic issue that you want to focus on to convey the meaning of the meaning you choose to give to the work, really. So this is what I would say. So semi-stage, I would say, is the early stages of the work. And that's why, technically going from semi-stage to fully staged, if, as we hope, there will be a fully staged, in fact, we will just, what will be is we will just, from the foundational work we will have done, from what we will have learned from that step, we can then develop all the other steps, really. And of course, we will learn a lot just by doing the semi-stage, really.
Yeah. So something that we have talked about in cutting down this 2.5-hour work to possibly about an hour. So really majorly cutting it down for the purposes of a video production, just with the thought that a 2.5-hour video opera is probably, I'm not sure I could sit through that, and I am a musicologist. So we've had to make a number of cuts, and we're thinking about approaching the cuts with regards to the plot. Actually, we're thinking about possibly cutting those two comic characters, with the thought that just with fewer people on board, we can have more rehearsal with the people we do have in front of us. Of course, that poses a lot of ideological problems. I'm sure that those listening can guess why, because that subplot is so crucial to the work at large and how it's conceived. How do we contend with that? If we all of a sudden don't have these comic characters, we have Apollo, we have Daphne, we have the character of Amor and that love triangle, and then we have a very interesting chorus that chimes in, sort of Baroque opera chorus, chiming at crucial moments to reinforce ideas and so on. How do we contend with the potentiality of missing that subplot? What do we do about it?
Well, you know, the first idea, and I think this is something that we have to, you know, to really be very clear about, that is, you are always making choices. You know what I mean is that even if we play the piece from the last note to the first note to the last note, we would still be making choices. So, you know, there is a bit of a sense that there is something objective, but there is nothing objective. In any case, you will make choices. So, of course, some choices are more radical than others. But in any case, you know, when you're staging a piece, you are always making a selection. You are choosing what you will show, what you will communicate with the audience. That's the reason why we go and see the piece many times. You know, that's why, you know, we go and see one production, then another production, then another production. It's because those works don't exist in essence; they exist only in performance. So of course we will see that choice. So we will have to figure that out. You know, I know that sounds like I'm evading the question, but the reality is, in my experience, is, for instance, for me, in the end, the casting is the most important thing. You know that there is that stage saying is, once you have done the casting, you have done 98% of your job. But this is really true, in the sense that so much depends from the casting that you can have the greatest directorial idea, but then if you have a cast which doesn't work with that idea, what are you going to do? I mean, you just need to, you know, to change that. So I do think that starting from the cast and seeing what the qualities of the cast are will allow to construct the piece in the best possible way. And also, yeah, the performers are not some kind of puppets that we move around. You know, each of them will bring their own visual interpretation. So I think it will be making a synthesis of all those visions, which will create the project that will show in the summer. So.
That's very interesting. Before I ask you my next question, I just want to remind our audience that you are very welcome to ask questions in the chat, or you can email your questions to the Hispanic Society, and we'll answer them as we see them. So Guillaume, I wonder if we can finish the hour talking about your experiences, your experiences staging Baroque opera, staging semi-staging, staging oratorios. What are some of the sort of examples of how you use space? What are some of the examples of your work?
Yeah. So you know. Being a veteran of opera, I was kind of, unfortunately it's true, which means that I've done that for a long time. But the kind of experience which I bring specifically more to this project is the experience I did with oratorios. Now, why is that? As you might know, so the oratorio was a kind of sacred form of opera, which was done in Catholic countries during Lent. And because it was done as a form of penance, there was no staging whatsoever. It was a purely oral experience, that you just listen to it. So it was done in special places, in oratorios. And the singers would be standing on balconies and they would sing, and the audience would just listen to the story being told. And the stories often were stories of saints. So for instance, often there were stories, they were not the big stories, they were more the, stories like Mary Magdalene or Judith, Esther, all those characters, which of course, they are very, if you think about it, Esther, Judith, they are a little bit like Daphne in the sense, Susanna, just stories which actually are pretty close to the operatic stories. Anyway, what has been happening in the last few decades is those oratorios, the directors of, the artistic director of opera houses have discovered that those pieces are fantastic pieces to stage for two reasons. One is because, in fact, they were written on the model of opera, but they were much more contained. So usually there is only 4 singers, and it's 2 halves, and each half lasts 50 minutes more or less. So in fact, it's a perfect evening program, really. And so people have started doing
capitalism, doesn't it?
Yeah. So there have been, and it's happened that I was asked from quite early on to do some of the staging of some Handel work. I did the Soul by Handel, Belshazzar, and then a lot of Italian oratorios by Carissimi, with Stephen Stubbs in Seattle, by Stradella. So the great thing about those pieces is you really have to, there is no staging really. It's all in your mind. So you really have to start thinking a little bit how you're going to create a context. So sometimes it was fully staged, like in Frankfurt, but some other time, maybe we can just show the last slide for a second. This is an oratorio called, that was done in 2016 in just outside Rome in Nepi for the festival Alessandro Stradella. Stradella was a composer of the time of Scarlatti, of Cavalli Scarlatti. And so this oratorio was Santa Pelagia, Saint Pelagia, not a very well-known saint. But why I'm choosing this image is because, as you can see, there is nothing really. It was done in a stage, but I think it shows a little bit how, in fact, even when you have nothing, you have a lot. So just by using, so this is in a church in the Cathedral of Nepi, but just by using the body language of the performer, just very intent gaze, the lighting, the use of the space, you can actually create a narrative very easily. So it's really a matter of bringing down the signs, the theatrical sign, that is just really focusing on what you really want to say and going to something very, very clear and very minimalistic and intense. As you can see, you can see that in the body of the singer, Roberta Mameli, there is a lot of energy, a lot of focus. So it's really focusing on the key element, making them very clear and creating dramatic tension with you. So you can see here it's backlit, the light was coming from the windows, and then you have that semi-silhouette, the face turning. So it's really working in a minimalistic way. I would say that's one way of dealing with
very Baroque lighting as well.
Yeah, that's a courtesy of the architect of that church. Yeah.
Which is not an accident. Do you remember what is happening at this moment in the piece? At the time that this picture was
Yes, it's at the end. It's at the end of the piece when Saint Pelagia decides to, the story is always the same one. The story of, if I may use, I'm using those words with irony, of course. All those oratorios tend to emphasize on lost women who find the right way, and so this is what's happening to Santa Pelagia. She's seeing the light literally. So, yeah. But again, one of the important things, and I know this is it's a very challenging thing for us, and that's what I was trying to say in the images at the beginning. And we can have a big discussion about that. I would say that in general, for the Baroque artist, the key thing is the expressivity of the moment. So, what really counts is they go moment by moment. So we tend to focus on the narrative, so we think that, the narrative of the history of Apollo and Daphne is a horrifying narrative, as, the person who asked the question earlier pointed out. It's a rape, basically. It is. That the story is very clear. Mm. What they did was they focused on a moment by moment. And I know that this is challenging for us to think in that way, but that's really how they thought about those things. And I think this is explained also how the gracioso worked. The gracioso meant that you were in a tragic moment and then you went to a gracioso moment. Mm-hmm. For us, this is a big challenge. And for the performer, it's very, very difficult. Just being, we are never in the present. We are always multitasking. You must also think of a society, a way of being, which is much more in the present. And maybe we have learned to be a bit more in the present, in this situation. I mean, this is challenging for sure.
Absolutely. Does that duality come from does it come from Petrarch, Pietrovolezza, and Gravita? This kind of, is that expressed in Spanish writing in the later?
Yeah. So, in general, all the thinking of the period is very formalistic. So, they like what we don't like. They like, if I can use a metaphor, black and white stories. What I mean is, of course, it's often very, as you have all seen Baroque building, they are very symmetrical, they're very constructed, So, as you pointed out, it's gravitas and grace, So, the masculine dualities, the masculine, the feminine. So, again, we have to see them as tools, not as essences.
Right.
And that's my take.
Indeed. Yeah. There is another question from email. Are there Baroque dances specified in the score of Apollo and Daphne and in other zarzuela scores? This, by the way, comes from Christopher Williams. This is a wonderful choreographer and a collaborator of mine and friend. Are there dance pieces in zarzuela scores more generally? And if so, how do you imagine treating them now and down the road in a fully staged production? Maybe I'll start by answering that. We'll cover that more completely in our next installment of this series in March when we talk about the music and we talk about some of those musical choices. But something that we have talked about is a way of using the band, single strings, large continua band, wonderful large continua band, to possibly take over with some of the crucial arias or moments that we might miss if indeed we cut the opera in this way, sort of using the sound of the orchestra sort of non-diegetically, so to speak, to carry the narrative forward. And that might require that we go into the Spanish dance repertory and make some additions, which we think may have been done back in the day. But we're still working that out, and we'll talk more about that in March. But Guillaume, do you have anything to add to
just that? Indeed, dance was crucial, in Commedia Nueva. We know that, in fact, in a lot of the comedias by Calderón, Lope de Vega, in fact, there are scenes of dance. One of the key characters of those commedia often is the dancing master. So dance was essential for those in those works. In Spanish theater, dance is very integrated, as it was in early Italian opera. In Seicento, in Cavalli's operas, there were always dances at the end of the act. Now the problem is, and I don't know exactly what it is for the zarzuela, for the Cavalli operas, we never have the music. So, the music was always kept aside. So in fact, we know that there were dance, because in the libretto there is written, dance of warriors or dance of, there is a famous, in Callisto, there is a famous dance of bears, but we don't have the music. So, yeah, but dance was very integrated. One thing, we tend to separate acting, singing, and dancing they did not, you know, for them a performer was somebody who could act, sing, and dance. So it's only later, it's only by the end of the, you know, it's only during the 18th century that those skills become very separated. But in the 17th century, early 18th century, you know, the performers were complete performers. They could really do the three things, you know, they could really handle the three characteristics.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm just noticing that we're at the hour, and so I want to thank Guillaume Bernardi from the bottom of my heart for joining us for this project, and with great thanks to the Hispanic Society for continuing to hold the concert series in these times. And we're excited to see you next month when we talk more about the music of Apollo and Daphne, and we will see you then. Oh, we just have one more question. Can we fit one more question in? This is from Barbara Hanning, musicologist. Professor Hanning writes, there is violence in Baroque opera from the beginning, not just in Daphne, but Orfeo, in which Eurydice dies by snakebite. Yes, and Orfeo is torn apart at the end by women. So the idea of sometimes violent action and reaction is at the heart of Baroque art, both on stage and visual art.
Absolutely, 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 absolutely. You know, for sure. I mean, you know, I mean, yeah, beyond I mean, just, you know, just if you look at the painting, I mean, you know, just think of one of the most, I mean, if you look at all the Salome or the Judith, I mean, you know, it's clear that it's a period which, I mean, it was certainly a very violent period, and a period which didn't recoil from representing violence. I do think that the issue, the challenge, I think, is, and they certainly challenged a lot with that, they struggled a lot with that issue, is how to represent violence. I think for me, the issue is the representation of violence and the meaning of violence and what is violence. So I think those are the issues that need to be explored. But beyond any doubt, I mean, it's a period which, you know, I mean, had an incredible familiarity with, yeah.
Absolutely. There's also so much subversion happening in the Baroque. Think of Caravaggio.
Absolutely, absolutely.
The feminized idea of beauty with his beautiful masculine bodies. And then we think of these other types of subversion, Artemisia Gentileschi, sort of taking the Judith beheading Holofernes and making it into a kind of self-portrait in a way, very feminist kind of interpretation. So it's going to be up to us to look at this striking cast of 7 women in the context of the Baroque and find this balanced narrative that we want to convey. Well, thank you very much, Guillaume, and thanks to everybody listening, and we look forward to seeing you next time when we talk about the score of Apollo and Daphne. So,
thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth.